So first of all, thank you to everybody who's joining us this afternoon for what promises to be a wonderful conversation. My name is Vincent Sutherland. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and really thrilled to be in conversation with Professor Deborah Archer and Professor Tony Thompson. This conversation, where do we go from here? A conversation about the future of race and inequality in America. And before we kind of dive into this conversation, I want to kind of briefly introduce Tony and Deborah, and then talk a little bit about the center itself. But first, by way of introduction, Deborah Archer is an associate professor of clinical law at NYU School of Law. She's the co-faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and director of the Civil Rights Clinic at NYU School of Law. Tony Thompson is the founding faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and Law, is also a clinical professor of law, or professor of clinical law at the law school, and co-director of the Criminal Defense and Reentry Clinic at the law school as well. I'll save kind of the longer introductions for you to just read about them on NYU Law's website. Trust me when I say they both had incredibly illustrious careers doing the work of racial justice, civil rights, and human rights throughout the entire course of their careers. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But first, Tony and Deborah, Tony, let me actually start with you. What's the focus of your kind of individual work, and how did you end up in that particular space or with that particular focus?
Broadly speaking, my work, thank you, by the way, Vincent, and thank you to those who are attending this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. Generally, my work is at the intersection of race and justice. It evolved out of a practice career. I spent a decade as a public defender in Northern California. After that, I was in private practice. I prosecuted civil rights claims that were brought privately and did a range of other things. I've taught in the 25 years I've been on the faculty. I've taught everything from civil litigation to criminal defense. I teach a leadership course. So there's a range of topics. I think that the intersection with the subject matter and the center have been exciting, obviously, given what's going on today. But it's been the natural trajectory of, I think, a career of what I believe the responsibility of lawyers and the law is in general, and what I think is relevant in terms of moving towards a society that reflects opportunity and equality much better than we've been able to do. So I think that that's generally and broadly speaking how I've gotten to this, along this journey.
Great, thank you, Tony. And Deborah, same question for you. Tell us a little bit about the kind of focus of your individual work and how you ended up in that particular space with that particular focus.
As you mentioned, I teach the Civil Rights Clinic at NYU. And through the clinic, my students and I represent victims of injustice and discrimination in a variety of civil rights matters, including challenging racial inequality. And in the clinic, we believe in the importance of representing individual victims of discrimination, but also working in coalition with marginalized communities to advocate for systemic change. And so we believe and work towards fighting for equality using both those tools, attacking unjust systems, but also influencing the everyday interactions that determine whether or not subordinated people have real power to affect their futures and to lead choice-filled lives. In terms of practice, I worked at the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund before I started teaching full-time. And there I worked on both individual and systemic reform cases in voting rights, employment discrimination, economic justice, and educational equity. And it's important to me that the students I work with in the clinic have a similar exposure to the range of work and the range of tools so they can see how all of those things work together to achieve change. And then as a scholar and an advocate, my individual research focuses on identifying and challenging sources of racial inequality. And recently I've had a more specific focus on trying to understand the modern drivers of racial segregation and concentrated poverty, and exploring what predominantly white communities have done and are continuing to do to ward off integration and to hoard the kind of opportunities and resources within their communities that would be helpful in advancing equality.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Now, Tony, as the founding faculty director, I just want to hear from you. And if you could tell folks kind of what was it that drove the need to actually create a center at NYU Law. Of course, law school is a wonderful institution, offers a lot of course offerings and a lot of other resources for students. So why create this center on race and equality in the law? What's the need for that?
It's a great question, Vincent. I think there are a couple concerns, right? First, the overarching issue was student advocacy. Students had called for the development of a center like this and advocated for it for years. And so that's, one part of this. But the center was created with the belief that the 21st century lawyer in America can't fully understand the American legal landscape unless they understand and appreciate how complicated the dynamics of race and inequality are and how they shape and continue to shape American law. I think the other thing is, as a leading law school, we believe that we should have a voice in the conversation around race and equality. The other thing I think for a center like ours is that this intersection, and Deborah mentioned it briefly, and I'm going to put her on the spot in a minute, but the intersection of scholarly work and activism. So when I look at your work, Vincent, around race and technology, and the fact that you've not only written in journals, but you've been part of the national leadership around the conversation of race and technology, which I hope you'll talk about a little bit. And Deborah's work, her groundbreaking work, and a piece she's got coming up on infrastructure and the effect on Black home ownership. Both of those efforts in a scholarly way are leading the conversation nationally around race, the law, and inequality. And that's what we hoped the center would do when we founded it.
Great. And thank you, Tony, for that. And of course, that history and that historical kind of arc that you described, and even kind of the work that we want to do, really has informed much of what we've been engaged in since the center launched back in 2017. And for those who are not familiar with that launch, it really began with a conversation between Sherrilyn Ifill, Bryan Stevenson, and Attorney General Loretta Lynch. And that was kind of the first in a series of public conversations that we've had over the course of the center's life. Our work has really, I think, been multifaceted, and we've engaged in litigation, advocacy, public education, and research, really at a kind of a nonstop pace since we were launched in February 2017. Just a few days really after the current occupant of the White House was sworn in, ushering in kind of a very, I think, disturbing era that we're all kind of wading our way through right now. And just talking briefly about kind of the center's work, part of that is focused on helping others see the world with a racial justice lens and kind of driving and shaping the narrative around race and inequality. And so in that space, we've either hosted or co-hosted or partnered on close to 40 events, public conversations, webinars, trainings, focused on race and inequality with advocates, experts, organizers. We filed or signed on to amicus briefs in about 8 cases in state Supreme Courts in the United States Supreme Court, focused on issues of race and inequality, kind of surfacing those issues in those cases. We've published 2 books with the New Press, flowing from a couple of our public conversations, and with a 3rd book on the way that is a collection of the Derek Bell lectures on race in American society. You mentioned kind of other areas of work. Part of our work is involved in the intersection of race and technology. And so in that space, we've worked with kind of a national coalition of advocates who've shifted the conversation around the way in which these technological tools, they're often relied upon or looked to help decision makers and work in ways that would kind of cleanse our systems from the taint of racism, help shift that conversation and help people realize that it actually, it's often the case that these tools can perpetuate bias and really help to drive and reflect back the racism we see in society. It can be used to really terrible ends and not achieve the kind of goals we want. Our community justice work, Deborah mentioned some of that, is really focused on developing resources and materials and helping and working with communities so that we can ensure that their voices are heard and in front and center when thinking about alleviating and eliminating the barriers to racial equality. So eliminating racial inequality in housing, education, community development, the barriers to our participation in our democracy, really confronting segregation in all its forms. And our criminal legal system work has really focused on working with advocates from across the collection of advocates here in New York State and nationally really trying to address and confront the ways in which race and inequality have shaped outcomes in the criminal legal system, and have really produced a system that has evolved from what we saw with enslavement and the ideologies that undergirded that entire regime. And so we've done some work that's focused on trying to reform the parole system in New York State. We've challenged the criminal legal system practices and policies that have been affected by race and inequality. Like we just filed an amicus brief in a case regarding nine unanimous jury verdicts in Louisiana, a holdover from an era of racial terror, and trying to kind of that silenced Black jurors, and so that's been a part of our work too. And of course, all that, as you mentioned, has not only been done with the students in mind, who advocated and pushed for this center to be created, and in line with kind of the strategic plan that the law school had, but also we've been grounded kind of at the law school. We've had the great pleasure of working with over 30 students as student fellows. We have a fellows program that's been supported by the law firm Paul Weiss. We had close to 40 students volunteer with us right in the wake, or as the rebellions around racial injustice were coming into the fore over the last early part of June and late May. They produced protest tips, resources for anti-racism and advocacy. And we worked in partnership with institutions and organizations across the university. And I'm not going to name them, because when I start naming names, I'll forget somebody. And so, I think all of that work is pointed kind of to the types of things that we wanted to do when the center was founded, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of it. That last point about kind of our involvement with students and volunteers makes me want to kind of talk about the moment that we're in right now. And I want to kind of hear from you, as folks who have, throughout your careers seen a lot and done a lot. If there are moments in your careers that you've seen that were maybe similar to what we're living through right now, if you remember kind of the first or early protest movement or social justice movement that you were a part of, and if you could tell us a little bit about that, and then I'll kind of shift gears and talk about kind of the protests of today. So let me start with Deborah.
I'm going to go first.
Yeah. Let me start with
that Tony's going to tell a story about him being 5 years old and marching for voting rights. And I don't have a similar story.
Okay.
I don't have
comment on my age, but we'll talk about that later.
No, just at the core of your involvement from the very beginning. I don't have a very early history of involvement in traditional protests like the ones that we're seeing now. I'm a first generation American citizen, and as immigrants, my parents were very concerned, I would say terrified about not causing trouble and not wanting to jeopardize in any way their life or our life in this country. But what they did was always encourage me to push back and to demand that I be treated with respect and equality. And so I would say my early involvement in protest is what you might call micro protests, or engaging in kind of small acts of resistance that Black people have engaged in throughout our history. I grew up in Connecticut, and when I was young, my parents moved us from Hartford, Connecticut to Windsor, Connecticut, which is a working class suburb of Hartford. And they did that because they wanted us to have a chance for a better life. Windsor was safer. They had better schools. And when we moved, we were the first Black family on our block, and only one of 2 Black families in the entire neighborhood. And our neighbors certainly let us know that we were not allowed, that they did not want us to be there, that we weren't welcome. And I remember one day we woke up to find that our house had been vandalized and KKK had been painted on our house and our car. And I was about 9 or 10, and my parents had to explain to me who the KKK was. And for a long time, I was terrified to go back to living our life in that community. And I had to go live with my grandparents. My parents encouraged me and told me that I needed to push back and to fight back against the people who tried to drive us from our home. So for me, going back into that house was my earliest memory of resistance. Me playing in our yard and going to the neighborhood playground, I viewed all of those acts as acts of protest. And my parents still live in that house today. although they should have moved a long time ago. But I think they view that continuing to live in that neighborhood and to claim that house and that space as their own as an act of resistance. It wasn't until I got to college and law school that I understood the importance of joining my voice with other voices and the power of collective action. And then I also understood that even as students, we had power. And I started to understand the full range of tools and strategies we could engage as part of protests. So I participated in or helped organize protests against the administration's response to racism when I was in college, the Rodney King verdict, the lack of diversity in faculty and in students when I was in law school. I remember participating in protests around apartheid and South African divestment, helping to organize protests when F.W. de Klerk came to speak at Yale University because of his role in supporting and enforcing apartheid. And through all of those activities, I think I learned really the foundational tools that I continue to use as I engage in protests now.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. And I really kind of appreciated that story and kind of your story about kind of that history and the importance and critical importance of these small acts of resistance that I think are, you know, people see people out in the streets and think like, I need to be out there. And the reality is that you need to do what you can do from where you are. And I think that arc really demonstrates that beautifully.
Absolutely, I think that's important. And I think people sometimes in thinking about history will say that folks who were enslaved didn't resist, but they resisted every day in ways that some of us will never be able to understand or appreciate. But resistance was constant throughout slavery, throughout the civil rights movement, in ways that we fail to acknowledge all of the time.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. Tony, tough act to follow.
It is, and Deborah, since she's put the context in age, I really don't want to talk about early involvement. I'm in an interesting intersection, right? So my mom is a first-generation immigrant from Central America, and my dad was the grandson of a slave. And so I had some of the pressures that Deborah described growing up, but my mom, to this day, she's 92 and still an activist, was pretty active when I was very young and encouraged us to have a very robust conversation at home and a robust conversation around the dinner table. And so I took that out into the communities that I worked in. I won't talk about high school because neither of you were born, and probably most of the people listening to this weren't born yet. But what animated my involvement in protests started pretty early on, and it focused on some of the same stuff, ironically, that Deborah talked about, which was apartheid. One of the people who was very influential to me was a poet laureate from South Africa, Dennis Brutus, who had been involved in activities, anti-apartheid activities. When I met him, I was captivated and understood that American apartheid looked somewhat dissimilar, but was very similar in some ways to South African apartheid. And so that movement of divestment around stocks and businesses doing work in South Africa, around the universities and colleges, stock investments in South Africa, really set a foundation for me. And the other thing it did is it spoke to me about what an education should look like. So part of an education was the formal things that happened in a classroom. But a lot of education, be it a college education or a law school education, involved being aware and involved in what was going on in the communities and society around you. And so that, when I think of the role of a clinician, it is not only to teach the skills that we need to have mastered in a classroom and in a courtroom, but it is to be contextual in terms of what's going on in the real world at that time. And so I grew up as a young person in high school and college and law school, always seeking out some context for the legal education I was getting. It was quite formal. And I think that has informed not only the way I've developed as a scholar and an activist, but also how I've developed as an academician. And so I think that it's very important that we not be wedded to age-old teaching notes and age-old texts, but that we contextualize that in terms of race and inequality and what's going on in the world around us. And so that's really kind of how I began to get involved in protest movements and how they made sense to me.
Great, thank you, Tony, and really kind of great to hear about those kind of early movements that I'm sure kind of sparked a lot of folks' desire to do something and change the world that they saw around them, and bring kind of that context to bear. And I guess kind of speaking of thinking about the world around you and kind of what that looks like, you know, and turning our attention to the rebellions that are and protests that are still happening right now, despite kind of the lower level of coverage. I think in some places they're still happening in cities across the country every day. You know, I'm kind of curious to hear from both of you, like, why are these particular sets, why is this kind of moment different? Why are these protests different? We've had Black people killed by the police before. We've had Black people die in police custody before. Eric Garner was choked to death in 2014. Mike Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri shortly thereafter. Sandra Bland mysteriously dies in police custody. Alton Sterling, Tamir Rice, Maya Hall, Freddie Gray. I mean, the names are almost like etched in everyone's memories at this point. But it feels like with George Floyd's death, there's something different. And so I'm curious to hear from you, like, why do you think that is, or if you think that is the case?
Let me weigh in. So I actually think there are two pieces here, right? So the first piece was, you're right. By every stretch of the imagination, George Floyd could have just been another hashtag. But I think that the two things I want to talk about are timing and context, right? So with regard to timing, what happened was we saw Ahmaud Arbery murdered by three individuals, and no charges were filed. And that video went viral. We then saw Breonna Taylor murdered in her bed, and no charges were filed. Then what happened was a period of time where we had a lot of individuals using 911 and weaponizing it as a racial tool to threaten police interaction and police enforcement of false racial boundaries, calling 911 on Black people for just living their lives, which culminated in Amy Cooper's call against Christopher Cooper, where the video showed he was engaged in no illegal conduct, but she was on the phone simultaneously saying he was threatening her life. On that same day, and no charges were filed, I should say, on that same day, hours later, George Floyd, over a period of 8 minutes and 46 seconds, was tortured and murdered. Again, no charges were filed. The difference with those instances of conduct by law enforcement and others was that for the first time in modern history, literally, a large portion of the world's population was sequestered at home. So in addition to these things happening on television and going viral on social media, something very important also happened. And that was the fact that many Americans that are unaffected, that are not people of color, often simply allowed their daily lives to distract them or to change the channel, frankly. We didn't see that here. So two things happened related to that. One was we saw these incidents over and over and over again. And a slice of the population that had never seen this was forced to be exposed to it over and over again. And you had a nation, for the first time, quite frankly, in small town America with very small populations of people of color, saying, enough is enough, never again. Finally, related to that, and totally unexpectedly, not only were people of color and other good thinking people in this country saying no more, but we saw around the world that people were also exposed to this because of social media and because of the coverage. So you began to see people whose imagination had been captured by a history of colonialism and imperialism that had informed unjust and unequal policies around the world. So it was not just an American phenomenon of American racism, but it was a question about the way that authorities enforced unequal policies, economic inequalities, and racial and ethnic and social inequality. And so we saw this intersection of all these events happening at once, of people being captured and have to engage in it, and the response being that America was not only brought to its knees, but brought to its senses and horrified by the images that were captured. We then began to see some charges and other things happen. But I think that those were the primary differences between the incidents that you described in the question and what we've seen happen.
And just to add to that conversation, Tony mentioned enough is enough, and Vincent, you said we've been here before. We have been here before where there was a police killing, people protested, and lots of promises were made. And I think that people really right now are just truly done with this cycle of police killing, protest, empty promises, followed by more police killings, protests, and empty promises. And they're tired, and they're not going to rest until they see more than empty promises or the reforms that tinker at the edges. And I'm grateful that everyone has continued to take to the streets every day to demand change. But I also think that we're seeing preparation and opportunity coming together in a really powerful way. People were ready for this. They were ready because of the work of activists and organizers and lawyers over many years. And we are seeing the work of so many people who worked on racial justice long before this moment. Artists had films ready to go, scholars had books and articles, advocates had policies and platforms, there were resources and educational materials, there was legislation that was already in the pipeline. And I think we're also seeing a broader and more intentional network of people with deep relationships and communities who are ready to do the work of supporting both the protests and calling for transformation in meaningful ways. And we are seeing the impact of networks and infrastructures and coalitions that were built and nurtured since the killings of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Tamir Rice. Communities were constantly at work in the background over this time to make sure that we were ready for this moment right now. And then finally, I'll just want to add that the broader community right now, I think, is actually Black people as central to the movement and the moment, not just saying that our voices are important and that they hear us, but seeing that Black people are actually the backbone of this work and following their lead. And as a result, we're advancing a conversation that includes all Black voices, not just focus on killing of Black men, but it's a conversation about all forms of police violence. It's a conversation about Black women, Black people with disabilities, Black trans folks. And we're trying to make sure that the conversations are inclusive and that justice is real and meaningful for everyone in our community. And I think that that has impacted the range of people that have come out, the number of people that have come out, and the fact that they continue to come out.
Let me add to that. I think that what's exciting to me about this moment is that it's, you know, we often get the remedy of we'll develop a commission, we'll do a study, and people are not standing for that. And also there's linkages between the overall problem of law enforcement and its impact, but also some of the economic structural problems that have been generated over time. And they're linking those as we talk about change. And I think that that's an important linkage and an important moment in our history.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to kind of turn to some of that in a few moments. But before I do, and I think kind of part of what both of you have been talking about is in terms of people being kind of fed up or frustrated or tired of the kind of pattern we've been with tinkering around the edges and reform. That certainly feels like something that's driving some of the more, I'll call them dramatic, although I don't know that they're, I say that only because it's different from the types of reforms people have been pushing before previously in terms of more mainstream movements around reorienting funding of police and thinking about defunding certain functions of policing and investing in communities in different ways and abolishing some of these systems that have been with us for such a long time and been problematic for such a long time and perpetuating some of the racial inequality we've been talking about. One thing I'm kind of curious to hear from you about, and maybe Deborah, you can take this one, is do you see any kind of echoes between the movement that we're in right now and movements of the past, where we've seen relatively dramatic changes and shifts in the way society thinks about or addresses issues of race and inequality?
There certainly are. So I think you have two different questions in there. One was about why the more transformative proposals, and one was about the echoes.
Yeah, I was. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Well, if Tony allows me, I'm trying to address both real quickly. On the echoes part, I've been doing some work and research right now on Black rage, and the role and impact that it has. And James Baldwin famously said that Black people in this country, to be Black in this country, and to be relatively conscious is to be in rage almost all the time. And for Black people, racial oppression is everywhere. It's nearly impossible to evade. And under these circumstances, rage is a natural and really justifiable reaction for people who have reached their breaking point, as we said, so many people have right now, after trying to survive, not just with racialized policing, but under multiple layers of discrimination and violence and indignity. And so the rage is a constant thread that runs throughout American history, from slavery to the civil rights movement, to the Black Power era to today. And it's helped to inspire uprisings and protests that have incentivized political action. And I think that is a thread, it's an echo to the past that I see. And it includes rebellions by enslaved people who fought for their freedom. It includes Bloody Sunday, when hundreds, including John Lewis, marched in Selma, Alabama, demanding voting rights. And that helped to spur the adoption of the Voting Rights Act. And it includes uprisings in Watts and Newark and Detroit that led to the adoption of Fair Housing Act. And following COVID-19 ravaging our communities and the police killings of just too many people, I think that rage erupted and spread across the country and is really animating protests, not only in support of Black lives or demanding the end to racialized policing, but as Tony mentioned, in really calling for an acknowledgement of the full truth of anti-Black discrimination in all its forms. Why we are seeing more transformational approaches this time than we have in the past, I think it's because we've had that conversation about reform before. And many people believe reform is not necessarily the right or progressive thing, or they think that we've tried enough reform and now it's time to get rid of the system. There were attempts to reform slavery, by example, banning intense cruelty near the end. There were attempts to reform Jim Crow. We're still trying to reform the death penalty. We moved from hangings to firing squads, to the electric chair, to lethal injections. And so I think at some point people think enough reform. It's time to start with a new system. And I also think there's a recognition of the limits of the reforms people are calling for. So for example, most of the reform measures targeting use of force have exceptions when an officer believes that their life is in danger. But in a country that has such a deep and long history of deploying racial stereotypes about the excessive dangerousness and criminality of Black people, the word danger swallows the rest of the rule and there's no real reform. Many of the reforms we were talking about were also in place when killings have happened, and they didn't prevent the violence and the death. So a few years ago, the call from everyone was for body cameras. And Derek Chauvin was looking directly into the camera as he murdered George Floyd. Chokeholds were prohibited when Eric Garner was killed, and the officer who killed Rashard Brooks had just completed hours and hours of de-escalation training. And we have calls to ban chokeholds and needed neck restraints, but we would still allow and not address killings with guns and tasers and batons. And finally, these reforms don't really address culture. And again, culture is going to swallow any policy reform that we see. Yeah. We're seeing it right now in New York City in the fight that the NYPD has lodged to keep police records and records of police misconduct secret, despite the changes to 50A in New York, the law that had kept them secret in the past. So I think people calling to defund the police or abolish the police believe we need structural changes that actually ensure the equal application of the laws and ends the kind of policies and practices and systems and culture that are feeding the criminal justice system, so that we don't just end up here again in a few years asking for the same changes.
Tony, I don't know if there's anything to add to that. It feels like
this is the great thing when you work with really talented people. There's not much you have to do. I'll just add two things. One is that I think when you talk about why is this transformative, there are some echoes to education as well. So when I was in law school and I was a clinic student, if you were proficient in courtroom advocacy, that would be sufficient. That would be enough to propel you and to have a successful career as a lawyer. In the 21st century, what we've learned is the same thing exists in a clinical classroom as does in the street. And that is, not only must you be good at your basic form of advocacy, but you must have some resilience and ability to get engaged in media advocacy, in social media advocacy, in community advocacy. Those are skills that we need to teach, but those are skills that many activists have begun to master. Let me tell you, from Trayvon Martin to Ahmaud Arbery, those cases would not have been filed but for social media and the campaigns that were put forth on social media. So part of the transformative nature of this work is our ability to pull those levers and those tools. Finally, I think that ultimately when you look at the work that's being done, defund the police is the headline. And people who don't want to address it say, oh, we can't defund the police. What defund the police really means is that we need to rethink at a fundamental structural level what policing means. We need to stop sending police in where what is needed is a different kind of expertise. And therefore we need to move funds away from law enforcement into other areas to better our society and create more equality. Finally, this also involves prosecutors and judges. When we talk about defund the police, it also means that prosecutors need to change their relationship with police unions and police leadership and begin to prosecute where necessary and appropriate police agencies like they do everyone else. And courts need to be sensitive to issues of race and inequality and do their jobs in a different way. So it's easy to say, oh, those are crazy people saying defund the police, but that really is just the headline to get to a rethinking of a structural relationship between communities of color and our criminal justice structure. And so I think those things begin to inform how transformative this process will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels like in a lot of ways we've been kind of thinking about trying to change these systems. We've been stunted by our own lack of imagination because we've been beaten down for so long by systems that have been basically broken on purpose and enforcing a regime of racial terror that is woven into the kind of fabric of our country. And so I think it's really great to see kind of these questions being asked and these efforts being made to force people to think differently about how we might go about doing this, and provide communities with the type of resources and investments and ensure that people are treated with dignity, unlike what we've seen over the kind of course of history. Tony, you're about to say something. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, ultimately what toppled South African apartheid and what will ultimately topple American apartheid is the fact that we need to think about the economic message, the political message, and the moral message. We must say to organizations that espouse racism, we won't patronize your business, we won't support you in any shape, form, or fashion. We must say to elected officials like the current occupant of the White House, if you're going to be a white supremacist and be in that position, we will resist you every day, every moment. It's only when this philosophy of an anti-racist philosophy cascades through all of America that we're going to see true change. I think for the first time in my lifetime, we're beginning to see the edges of that now. We're beginning to see the beginnings of that movement. And as Deborah quite eloquently said, I think there was some preparation for this coming. But the other thing is, this is not solely the responsibility of communities of color and people of color. This is an American responsibility. And until we understand that at our core, we're not really going to see substantive change.
Yeah.
Definitely. And Vincent, just to follow up on something that you said, that sometimes we are beaten down by the fact that we have been beaten down so many times and that we're constrained by our own lack of imagination. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the younger folks who are engaged in this movement in this moment, because they don't feel constrained about by the losses of the past. And they have imagination beyond belief, and they can envision a world and envision equity in a way that we have just never been able to. And I think we do ourselves a service if we fall back and follow their lead, because they are fearless and they are creative, and they are not in any way deterred by the losses of the past. Yeah,
definitely. I know you've kind of personally, I know we've all seen that, but I know you've personally seen that in some of the work that you've done with Teens Take Charge and kind of through your clinic and also through the center as well, working with young people around these issues.
Yeah, even this summer with Teens Take Charge, as some people will know, the city had moved to defund their summer youth employment program, which at this point is so important for teens in New York City to have that resource, to have something to do to help advance their own progress. And Teens Take Charge joined with other teens around the city and organized just in a way that was relentless and comprehensive, and did not stop until the city agreed to refund that program. And so I think we should all take examples from their work.
Definitely. So now, I'm kind of curious as we're thinking about as we're moving into the latter part of our conversation, how do we respond to all this and what's kind of next? Just a couple of days ago, the Attorney General, the top law enforcement officer, I think in many ways, he testified before the House Judiciary Committee, in many ways kind of demonstrated just how challenging change might be, at least at that level or in those offices. Denied there's any problem with race or racism in law enforcement, contrary to the kind of data that shows racial disparities at kind of every stage of the criminal legal system. His entire worldview suggested that these rebellions and uprisings are illegitimate in some ways, vilified protesters as terrorists, as thugs. We've seen a dramatic uptick in prosecutions of protesters and people who are advocating for racial justice in federal court with overly harsh charges or cases that would ordinarily be in state courts or maybe not even prosecuted at all. We have a president who really is, George Wallace 2.0, it seems like in many ways. And so I'm kind of curious to hear from you both. And also, in a couple minutes, I want to talk about kind of how there are other issues outside of just policing and criminal legal system, of course. But thinking about what lawyers and advocates should be doing in a world where we have a DOJ that's not only unhelpful, but is actually kind of targeting communities who are speaking out and fighting for racial justice. What should advocates and lawyers be doing in this moment? What role should we be playing in these conversations? Tony, why don't we start with you?
I wasn't sure where you want to start. I think that no one is surprised that this Attorney General has been willfully blind to the blatant racism that takes place in and around communities in the United States. I think that the danger is every bit what you've described, but it's more. It's that this administration has kind of let the genie out of the bottle in terms of hyper racist conduct. And I think that it has signaled an approval of behaviors that in the past have been kind of in the shadows and under rocks. Now all those folks have climbed out from under those rocks and feel that they can publicly engage in discourse that was unacceptable a short time ago. I think that the great thing about this kind of administration is it signals to those of us who have always resisted racist behavior and unequal applications of the law that we need to continue to resist. I think that we said earlier, and I want to underscore something Deborah said, we need to not accept half measures, half truths, and half solutions. And I think that the wonderful thing about the young people that we see is that people are saying that we're not going to accept the bully pulpit of the White House or the bully pulpit of the Attorney General, that they're just other racists like any other racist, and we need to resist. And I think that that's what our challenge is today. And I'm gratified to see that not only are young people doing this, but I look at my colleagues in DC who all signed a petition to have William Barr disbarred. And I think that that's quite appropriate. I think that systematically, we need to look at the structures that we can implement to attack racism and inequality in a number of different forms.
Deborah, go ahead.
Just to add a little bit,
Sure.
I think in this, just a broader picture, in this moment, lawyers have to work on many fronts. We have to hold this administration accountable, ensure that they follow the law, respect the rights of all citizens, that they don't violate the Constitution to the best that we can. But we also have to fight back against the attempts to roll back the gains we've made in civil rights and racial justice. And over the past few years, we've seen frightening rollbacks in voting rights, in education, in immigration, in housing. And just yesterday, Donald Trump tweeted out something saying that people living their suburban dreams don't have to be afraid that affordable housing is going to be built in their community and bring crime and poor people of color and lower their property values, because he's putting an end to it and he's taking care of that. And we have to fight back against that type of action. And we also have to fight back against the narratives that they advance. For the last 3 years, I think each day has brought a new challenge, and we have continued to see lawyers rise to meet that challenge. But we also have to continue to work to affirmatively advance the civil rights and racial justice agenda and to challenge the entrenched inequality. Everything we do cannot be in response to this administration We can't allow them to set the racial justice agenda. We have to set that agenda. And in this moment, that agenda really does need to include taking advantage of this brief window of opportunity to start to dismantle the structure and architecture of inequality and help to build the infrastructure for equity and justice. So much of what this administration is doing right now is trying to distract us from the important work that we have to do. And even if we can't get transformational change tomorrow, we do have to start to lay the tracks while we have this opportunity.
Can I just ask Deborah, I would be remiss if I didn't at least raise the fact that when we talk about lawyers, I think it's a dual responsibility to work with activists and listen, and to also help lead. And Deborah's done this groundbreaking piece on looking at Black home ownership and all of the work that's going on nationally around infrastructure development. And I think talking a little bit about how those interplay would be helpful in looking at generally at the role that lawyers can play in specific circumstances when we talk about infrastructure change and development.
Sure. So I really think it's important. I mentioned this before, that I think one important issue for us to address and look at is segregation and community equity. Segregation, it often gets pushed to the back burner because we focus on other issues, but we can't fundamentally change inequality until we challenge segregation, because segregation helps create many of the conditions we see that are feeding the criminal justice system. And one of the drivers is the way many white people in white communities have claimed privileged spaces as their own, and they fight to preserve them as white spaces and to defend them against anyone they see as trying to violate that space. And they do that through violence, through courts, through the adoption of laws, and through policies and procedures that they've adopted. And one piece that I have been focused on that's related to that, as Tony mentioned, is the role of highways. And beginning in the 1950s in states around the country, highway construction displaced Black households and really cut the heart and soul out of thriving Black communities as homes, churches, schools, businesses were all destroyed. And in some other communities, the highway system was a tool of a segregationist agenda. And they erected a wall that separated white and Black communities and protected white people from Black migration. And in these ways, construction of our highway system contributed to the concentration of race and poverty, and it created physical, economic, and psychological barriers that I think persist to this day. And it's all part of a legacy of highway building that focused on growth and expansion at the expense of Black communities, building roads to whites-only suburbs through the middle of Black neighborhoods, and making sure that Black people didn't have that opportunity to move to those suburbs, to utilize the highways to access opportunities. And today, the interstate highway system is on the verge of transformational change as these aging highways around the country are crumbling and they're insufficient to meet growing demands, and they have to be rebuilt. So the possibility of cities around the country engaging in major infrastructure projects, including highways, offers a real opportunity to redress and repair some of the harm that communities of color faced that were caused by the original building of the highway system. And it presents an opportunity to strengthen impacted communities and to advance racial equity and economic opportunity moving forward. So I do think it is an opportunity that lawyers need to figure out. How do we engage in this? How do we participate? How do we empower communities to take advantage of this moment to change something that the builders of these highways saw that these would be permanent markers of segregation and permanently keep Black communities underdeveloped. And here we are in a moment where those permanent markers are going to be torn down. And we need to rise to the challenge to figure out what we can do.
Let me talk about two pieces, why that's so groundbreaking. Obviously, it's self-evident why it's some of the most important research that's being done now. But secondly, it's a template as we look at other aspects of our culture and how we're going to rebuild for the 21st century. We can take components of that and instill in it an anti-racist equality lens as we go to rebuild. So it would be one thing to say, let's just look at how we're going to make infrastructure investments. But the importance of this work is the backward look at what has happened previously. And I think it's a model. When I thought about kind of what we would do at the center, this is some of the best work that we can think about as we go forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tony. Yeah, no, I think that's, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's incredibly important because I think it also helps us think about these conversations beyond the rebellions in the streets that are really specifically targeted or focused on policing in our criminal legal system, but recognizing that as we try and dismantle some of those systems, the really important and incredibly crucial work is the type of work that Deborah's talking about, which is really dealing with the infrastructure, the investments, the communities, that building up those facets of our society, because they've been for too long failing Black people, and failing them on purpose, which is kind of, I think, a really sad reality. um, and I think, speaking of that, alongside this current moment that we're in around racial justice, we also are living in the midst of course, um, a global health pandemic that's forced us to be on Zoom rather than in front of people live and with each other in person. Um, and of course, has had these incredibly disparate impacts on Black and Latinx communities, on people in prisons, on people who are already marginalized or already in vulnerable positions. Um,
Mhm.
and have driven kind of massive racial disparities. And so I'm kind of curious to hear from you both about what we should take away from kind of those disparities, and how we should, um, uh, how that should influence or shape our work, going forward when we're thinking about racial justice. And Deborah, why don't I start with you?
So there's an old saying that when America catches cold, Black people get pneumonia. And that really speaks to what we're seeing in this global pandemic, not only for Black people, but for Latinx and Indigenous people as well. COVID-19 was introduced into a society and systems that are profoundly racially discriminatory in individual, institutional, and structural ways. And people of color are not more innately susceptible to coronavirus, or as a state GOP rep said, more susceptible to coronavirus because we don't know how to wash our hands. It's because of years of inequality. And because of that, we are more likely to be exposed to the virus and are at greater risk of developing complications once we've been um, exposed. And we are also going to experience, I think, a disproportionate share of the fallout from the virus and the lockdowns that we are going through right now. And we need to talk about why that is, and not just end the conversation by pointing to underlying health conditions and then work to change those things. So a few of the things: longstanding disparities in access to hospitals and doctors. In New York City, that has included community hospitals that were closed or chronically underfunded. That contributed to Black and Latinx people being less likely to be tested for COVID-19, and then being more severely impacted once they contracted the virus. But it's also about highly dense, segregated housing. Again, segregation, I'm going to keep trying to ring that bell. Highly dense, segregated housing in under-resourced communities that contributed to racial and ethnic disparities. Also, the increased likelihood of living in a community or in housing that's plagued by environmental stressors, such as mold or lead paint, lack of access to clean water, or communities that have highways that run through them, or in other environmental hazards. It's also the greater likelihood of working in low-wage jobs, of losing those jobs, or being compelled by economic necessity to go to work without the luxury of being able to work remotely, of having to take public transportation to get to those jobs. It's about low-income students, particularly students of color, who are going to suffer the long-term impact of our schools closing. They lost access to school lunch programs. They didn't have access to the equipment, to the internet service, to even just the space that's necessary to receive the benefits of remote learning. We do need to view some of the COVID inequalities we see now as emergencies and address those emergencies, respond to the immediate needs. But we also have to address those very fundamental, long-standing structural inequalities that have resulted in such an imbalanced burden.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Deborah.
the only thing I'd add is, I think, or highlight in what Deborah said, is that when I look at Latinx and other communities of color, when you look at how the gig economy has been affected, when you look at who has to go to work, who has to deliver groceries, who has to deliver food, because they don't have the luxury of being able to be off during this time, I think that's one huge piece in this. And I think the long-term piece that we've got to keep our eye on, Deborah also mentioned, was that there's a digital disconnect between communities of color, immigrant and poor communities, and other communities. So keeping an eye on what it means to close schools and who has the internet bandwidth to be able to be involved and who has the equipment to be able to be involved is something that I think we have to be very much focused on.
So we have a few minutes left, and I want to ask just maybe two more questions of you both. For folks who are listening in, kind of, we're advocates, lawyers, community members, I'm really concerned about the things that are seeing around them in the world. What are the one or two or maybe three things that they really need to focus with intensity on right now? You know, given kind of all that we've kind of talked about, in your view, what are the kind of one or two things that they should really stress or put their shoulder into? So Deborah, maybe I'll start with you, and then.
Well, I will start with Tony because I just talked a lot.
All right. All right, Tony, I'll start with you.
You know, I think a couple of things. One, right, the partnerships and collaborations that exist have to continue. You, in your opening remarks, Vincent, had mentioned quite accurately that we're not getting the media coverage on the demonstrations that continue to go on in cities and communities around the country. So not relying on that as a barometer or a metric for success. And then finally, we also talked a bit in this conversation about what you settle for in terms of resolutions to these issues. So I think focusing on structural change, focusing on real change, and accountability for that change, measurability for that change, and visibility for that change are key. I think that one of the things that I worry about when I look outside of activist communities and communities that are affected are that some of these people, when they go back to work, when the pandemic is taking a downturn, whenever that happens, will lose interest in this. So I think continuing to make this a front burner, relevant issue, no matter what is being covered on television, and to have very, very clear outcomes and measurable successes that we can point to when we look at what the change will be.
Thank you, Tony. And Deborah?
Yeah, we mentioned that this moment is also about the systems that feed into the policing system. I already mentioned segregation. And again, I hope that more people will think about joining the fight to challenge segregation, because the systems this country has built to protect white spaces have a tremendous impact on those who are left out. And it's not because people get some magical benefit from living close to white people or sitting in a classroom with white people. It's because you cannot separate the places people have access to from the opportunities that people have access to. So we have to have some concerted focus and challenge to that. And then again, to highlight our work on community equity. Manning Marable argued that our systems exist not to develop, but to underdevelop Black people. And to affect this underdevelopment, racism is embedded into the core of power, the economy, culture, and society. And he argues that Black people have been intentionally sacrificed to feed American success. That's also a thread that went through the 1619 Project, I think. And our challenge is to continue to identify those systems that feed underdevelopment and to challenge those systems. Many of them are not traditionally viewed as civil rights issues. So we think about education and voting rights and housing in a traditional sense. And we should continue to focus on those. But I think we also have to be creative and step back and really take a look at all of the systems that are continuing to feed underdevelopment in our communities and to make so many Black and brown communities inhospitable to widespread success.
Vincent, can I add two things?
Sure.
One is that I think what we tend to do is we tend to disavow more traditional methods. So I hear a lot of young people say, I'm not going to bother to vote because that's not radical enough for me. And we ended up with the current inhabitant of the White House in some small part due to that philosophy. Also, the Russians and other folks had an input into that. But the point is, I think that people today have to use every single lever at our disposal. We don't have the luxury to say we'll not use certain pulls. So that's one. The second thing is I want to talk for a minute because I know there's some law students and lawyers out there listening. And I want to say something specifically to them. And that is, as lawyers and as law students, we have a responsibility to lead. Ultimately, half of our presidents, a lot of our mayors and governors have a JD. And I think there's got to be conversations about what leadership and real leadership looks like, both at law school and in our profession. We have been both complacent and complicit in allowing single digits of Black law students and allowing very few Black faculty and allowing very few Black partners in law firms around the country. We have to resist that. And so I think there needs to be very real conversations both in law schools, in law firms, and legal organizations about race. That's one. Two, I ask people to be uncomfortable when they're in situations where they're all white or mostly white, and they're talking about issues that impact and affect all of Americans. I hear young people saying, it can't be about us without us. And my position is, we no longer live in a society where, whether it's in legal education or legal practice, we cannot have conversations about race and inequality and contextualize those conversations about the future of America. So it means that private sector folks have to look at their recruiting, their onboarding, their promotions around lawyers of color and people of color. It means that law schools have to rethink their curriculum and have to think about how we have and contextualize race in the context of the first year courses and the other curriculum courses. And we have to be uncomfortable when we look around and we don't see a diverse population, whether it's at our dinner parties or our partners meetings. That now is gotta be embedded indelibly in the future of America for us to truly reach a society that reflects the values it articulates and begins to walk that talk.
I don't think there's any other way we could end the conversation. I think that to me that feels perfect. Deborah, I don't know. You tell me if you. Okay. You know, it's been a real pleasure, real joy, and real honor talking with you both. And I hope everybody who's been watching this can see how kind of fortunate and lucky I am to work with these two incredibly brilliant, kind, thoughtful, and just wonderful people. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Please stay safe, be well, and keep fighting the good fight, keep getting into good trouble, as John Lewis would have said. And thanks again.